I want to talk about some brutal deaths today. Specifically, I want to talk about some really gruesome deaths that happened in the Old Testament. I'm also going to kind of give you the story around the deaths, the backstory, kind of what led up to it, because those stories are really interesting too. And the people who end up suffering these deaths, they deserved it. I got to give a little disclaimer before I go any further. I want to be clear that while we are talking about the Bible here, this is not a religious video. That's not the purpose of this video at all. I just want to tell you about some really interesting stories, some things maybe that you've never heard of before, maybe you don't even know that are in the Bible, but just some really interesting stories. So it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, you're a Christian, you're some other religion. If you're just vaguely interested in this kind of stuff, you're going to like these stories. Also, let me give this warning. These are gruesome stories. There are disturbing and gross details in some of these stories. So just be warned that that is what you're getting into by watching this video. All right, now that we got all the disclaimers out of the way, let's get right into it. So I've got 5 of these stories for you today. The first one is from the book of Judges. It's in chapter 3. This is about a man named Eglon. He was the king of the Moabites, the king of Moab. The nation of Moab were mortal enemies of the Israelites, along with a few other nations. And at this point in the book, Moab had allied with 2 of those other mortal enemies of the Israelites, the Ammonites and the Amalekites. And because of this alliance, they were able to overtake Israel, and it says that this led to 18 years of oppression. So King Eglon oppressed the Israelites for 18 years. Now we're told about Eglon's, his stature. Let me just tell you what it says. It says this: Now Eglon was a very fat man. I got to tell you that because it is important to how the story plays out. So after 18 years of this oppression, we're told that the Israelites cry out to God and that God sends a judge. A judge was not what you would think of as a judge, like a guy in a robe, but a judge was a military leader that God would raise up these judges to deliver the Israelites out of the hands of their enemy. Basically, there's this cycle that happens all throughout the book of Judges of the Israelites disobeying God. God allows their enemies to overtake them for a certain amount of years. After a certain amount of years, they repent and they go back to God, and then God raises up a judge to deliver them. We see this cycle all throughout the book of Judges, and honestly, it leads to some of the most dramatic stories in the entire Bible. So the judge that God raises up here is a man named Ehud, and there's something very special about Ehud. He's different in a special kind of way. We're told that he is left-handed. Keep that in mind because that's a very important part of this story, as you'll see later. So the Israelites are being made to pay a tribute to King Eglon. Basically, they're being made to bring in a bunch of their riches and probably grain and livestock and those kinds of things and give them over to the Moabites. And not only is something like this costing you a lot of money and resources, it's also embarrassing to have to go do that. But this is the kind of thing the Israelites have been suffering under for 18 years. Well, Ehud leads the group of people taking the tribute. After they have presented the tribute to King Eglon, he leaves, his group leaves, and he leaves. But at some point he stops and he goes back alone. And he goes back into the room where King Eglon is, and he tells King Eglon that he has a secret from him, a message from God, but that only King Eglon can hear it. And so King Eglon sends all of the people who are in the room with him, he sends them out of the room. Ehud did have a secret. Before this little meeting, he had crafted a short sword, about 18 inches long. Says it was a double-edged sword, so that's meant for stabbing. And because he was left-handed, he had this sword strapped to his right thigh. Presumably, this is the reason Ehud was able to sneak this weapon into the king's chamber. Most soldiers were right-handed, so they would carry their sword on their left thigh. So it seems like nobody thought to check Ehud's right thigh for a weapon. And here's what the text says happened next. Again, I hope you're not eating right now. It says, "And Ehud came to him as he was sitting down, and Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out." See, I told you it was gross. Now, after this happens, Ehud is able to escape out of a back door, and so the king is in there alone, dead and gross and everything. And it tells us that the king's attendants and his servants are like kind of embarrassed because they think he's using the bathroom for a long time, and so they don't want to bust in there, but they're not getting a response. So it was kind of a long time before they went in there and discovered what had actually happened to him. But as for Ehud, he escapes out of a back entrance. He goes back to the Israelites. He tells them about what happened. He rallies everybody together. They go and attack Moab, and it says they overthrow Moab. And we're also told that for the next 80 years, they are completely free from any type of oppression. So in my mind, that makes Ehud one of the coolest lefties ever. I put him right up there with Ken Griffey Jr. in that category. All right, the next brutal death I want to tell you about, this one involves two savage women. Now, this one also comes from the book of Judges, chapter 4. Like I said, the book of Judges is kind of crazy. I probably could have just done this whole list from the book of Judges, but they're not all from the book of Judges. But this one is. And this story begins as the Israelites have again come under the oppression of a foreign power. And in particular, there's this military ruler named Sisera, who's really being cruel towards the Israelites. It says he has 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. So the same thing happens eventually. The people cry out to God, and God raises up a judge to deliver, but this judge is actually a woman, and her name is Deborah. And I got to tell you, Deborah did not play. She did not mess around. One day, Deborah calls this man named Barak, and apparently he was like a high-status military leader, and she says to him, she just kind of blasts him. She says, "Didn't God say that you should raise up an army and go fight Sisera?" But Barak is not feeling very confident about that, so he's like, well, okay, I'll raise up an army and I'll go fight Sisera, but only if you go with me. Maybe he thought that would make her reconsider wanting to go fight Sisera, but it did not. So she was like, okay, raise up an army, I'll go with you. But then she also says this little prophetic thing. She basically says because Barak was hesitant to do what he was supposed to do, he will not get the glory for killing Sisera, and that a woman will get the glory for killing Sisera. So they gather up the army, they lead the army down to fight Sisera, and it's just a complete butt whooping. In fact, I'll just read you what it says here. It says, "And all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not a man was left." So they just completely wipe out Sisera's army. But now as for Sisera himself, we're told that at some point he got out of his chariot and he was fleeing on foot. Now I'm not really exactly sure why he would do that, but probably because something like his chariot flipped over or it became non-functional in some kind of a way. Now after some time of fleeing on foot, he comes across a tent, and there's a woman in this tent, and when she sees him, she invites him inside. And this woman's name is Jael. Jael was married to a man who was part of a group that was sort of allied with Sisera and his group, so it probably looked like a pretty safe place for Sisera to try to hide out. And once she brings him in the tent, she's very hospitable towards him. He asks for some water. Obviously, he's exhausted. And she goes a step further and gets him some milk. And then she goes to helping him hide. She pulls up a rug and lets him hide under this rug. And he's telling her, like, okay, go stand by the door. And if anybody comes here looking for me, just tell them you haven't seen me. I'm not here. And she's like, yeah, all right, I'll do that. Well, this guy's obviously completely exhausted from fighting and fleeing for his life. So at some point while he's laying under this rug hiding, he falls asleep. He's out. And when Jael realizes that he is just out under this rug, he is sleeping heavily, she goes and she picks up a tent peg. Now a tent peg back then would have been a very sharp, heavy metal spike. And she ever so gently makes her way over to where Sisera is asleep. She places the tent peg right up to his temple. Then she takes a hammer, and here's what it says. She drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground, so he died. Well, yeah, that does tend to bring about death sometimes. Now, this was actually a very smart move by Jael to take care of this situation in this way. Very savvy on her part. And killing Sisera probably saved her own life. Because shortly after this, Barak shows up and he's been chasing Sisera. And so Jael goes out to him and she's like, hey, that guy you're looking for, he's in my tent. And I just nailed his face to the ground. So she understood that hiding this guy Sisera, who was hated by the Israelites and has now been thoroughly defeated by the Israelites, is not a good idea for self-preservation. And she realizes that, hey, if I just take this guy out while he's sleeping, maybe I can get on their good side and they'll leave me alone. And you know what? It worked. She actually became sort of a hero to the Israelites. If you were to look over just one more chapter into chapter 5 of Judges, There's a song that was written about Jael. Actually, the song was written about Deborah, but Jael has a pretty big part in the song about her taking the tent peg and putting it through the guy's skull. This is what it says. It says, "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple." So yeah, Sisera was taken down by a couple of women, Deborah and Jael. Hey, now would be a good time for you to pick up a tent peg and drive it through the temple of the like button. Now, the next story also involves a woman, but this time the woman is on the receiving end of the brutal death. And the woman we're talking about here was a queen. She was a wicked queen, and her name was Jezebel. There's a lot of backstory with Jezebel. I don't want to go into each and every detail. It'd take up too much time. But basically, the king of Israel has married this woman, Jezebel, and she was a Phoenician, so she was not an Israelite. And when she came to the palace, she brought all of her own religion. She brought all of her gods and her idols and her prophets and things like that. And not only that, she was very aggressive about making sure everyone followed these other gods. So as you can imagine, that did not go over well with a lot of the Israelites, and it didn't go over well with God. But she didn't care. In fact, she systematically hunted down the prophets of God to kill them and murder them, to the point where at one point what was left of the prophets of God were hiding in a cave just trying to survive from Jezebel's reign of terror. But the thing that seems to have angered God the most about what Jezebel did, it wasn't the worshiping of false gods or the killing of the prophets. It was actually the murder of this man named Naboth. Naboth was just a regular farmer. He owned a vineyard, and he was just kind of minding his own business, growing grapes and doing his thing. But King Ahab, he saw Naboth's vineyard one day, and he wanted it. He wanted it for himself because it was such a beautiful vineyard. So he goes to Naboth and he tries to buy it, and Naboth is like, "Thanks, but no thanks. It's not for sale." And no matter what King Ahab offers, however much money he offers to buy it for, Naboth doesn't want to sell. He wants to keep his property and keep his vineyard. So then King Ahab starts pouting about it. He's walking around the palace just frowning and pouting and down. And so Jezebel is like, "Well, what are you talking about, dude? You're the king. Why don't you just go take it?" And so Jezebel does just that. She goes to Naboth, she kills Naboth, and she takes his vineyard. And of all of the terrible things that Jezebel did, this one act seems to be the one that angered God the most, because it's the one that comes up over and over when it talks about how wicked she is. So now one of the most famous figures in all of Scripture is involved in the story of Jezebel. He's a prophet by the name of Elijah. Elijah performed some crazy miracles throughout his life, and we're not going to get into all that here. But even Elijah at one point was so scared of Jezebel that he fled and he hid from her. And this was even after God had used him to do a lot of these crazy miracles, and he had witnessed God do all these amazing things. Still, Elijah was scared of Jezebel, and he ran and he hid in this cave. And while he was hiding in a cave, God has to kind of come and speak to him and reassure him and tell him "Look, I got all this under control." And God kind of lets Elijah in on his plan to handle Jezebel. He tells Elijah that he's raising up a man named Jehu, and Jehu is going to be the next king after Ahab. And Jehu is going to take care of King Ahab and Jezebel and his entire family. So after this encounter with God, Elijah goes back to doing what he's supposed to do and, lives out the rest of his days. But it's actually Elisha. Elisha is the prophet who comes after Elijah, who is the one who later anoints Jehu as the next king of Israel. But now you have to understand that even though Jehu is anointed to be the king, Ahab and Jezebel are still king and queen, and they have no intention of giving that up. But there's an interesting prophecy that Elisha gives as he's anointing Jehu to be king. He says that Jehu is going to kill King Ahab and Jezebel and their whole lineage, basically. But he specifically mentions Jezebel, and he says that she will be eaten by dogs to the point where there's nothing even left of her to bury. So we fast forward a little bit in the story. There's been some battles between Jehu and forces of Ahab and Jezebel. At some point, Jehu's men do kill King Ahab, and they kill his 2 sons. And they chase Jezebel down to this city called Jezreel, which is kind of like her home base. And she flees up into this like heavily fortified tower. And as Jehu and his men are approaching this tower, she sticks her head out of the window at the top, and she's kind of taunting them and making fun of them. So here's what happens next, and I'm going to give you another warning. This does get gross. This comes from the book of 2 Kings, chapter 9. It says, "And he lifted up his face to the window and said, 'Who is on my side?' Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. He said, 'Throw her down.' So they threw her down, and some of her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her. Then he went in and ate and drank, and said, 'See now to this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter.' But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. When they came back and told him, he said, 'This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel, the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the faces of the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, This is Jezebel.'" So falling from a tower, being trampled by horses, and then eaten by dogs. Yeah, this was a terrible end, a terrible death, but fitting of such a terrible person. The next person we're going to discuss is Agag. Now, not only was Agag cursed by having a terrible name, but he also suffered a violent and brutal death. Agag was actually king. He was king of the Amalekites. And to tell you the backstory of his death, I'm going to have to go back a few hundred years to kind of give you the events that led up to this. I'll take you back to a time when the Israelites had just escaped from slavery in Egypt. God had done all these plagues in Egypt, and then eventually the Israelites fled across the Red Sea after it was split open. You know, they're being led by Moses. You're probably familiar with that story. But finally they cross across the Red Sea. The Egyptian army tries to follow. The waters come down, drown the Egyptians, and the Israelites are finally free. Now they're free, but there's a problem. They're in a desert. They're in what the Bible calls a wilderness, but it's basically just a desert. And they need things like food and water. And so survival becomes tough pretty quickly. Well, right at this time when they are at this really weak and vulnerable point, this group called the Amalekites starts attacking them. And it wasn't just like a straightforward army versus army attack. What the Amalekites would do is, as the Israelites are traveling through this desert, they would kind of pick off the people who were straggling behind. So you're talking about people who were elderly or sick, or maybe pregnant women and things like that. It was just a really cruel treatment of the Israelites. And because of that cruel treatment, God speaks to Moses. Moses, of course, is the leader of the Israelites at this time. And here's what God says to Moses. You can find this in Exodus 17:14. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.'" So God is saying here, at some point, he's going to completely wipe out all of the Amalekites from existence because of this thing that they have done. So now, we're going to fast forward about 300 years. Israel now is an established nation, and they're a fairly strong nation. They have a battle-tested leader in King Saul, and God is getting ready to make good on this promise of erasing the Amalekites from existence. So God sends word to King Saul through the prophet Samuel, and he says this. He says, "Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Yikes. So yeah, God wasn't joking when he said he was going to wipe these people out of existence. And now he has tasked Saul with doing that. So Saul gathers up his army and he goes down to where the Amalekites are, and he defeats them easily and kills most of them. It says, though, that Saul kept the king of the Amalekites, King Agag, alive. And he also kept their best livestock alive and kept them for himself, basically. And this would turn out to be a huge mistake in Saul's life. When the prophet Samuel, who had initially taken this word to King Saul to tell him what God wanted him to do, when the prophet Samuel finds out what Saul has done, Well, to say he's not happy about it is kind of an understatement. So Samuel takes off to visit the king. When Saul sees Samuel coming, he's like, "Hey, I did it. I did all those things that the Lord commanded." And Samuel's like, "Oh, really? Well, why do I hear all this noise from sheep and goats?" But Saul comes back with this defense like, "Oh, I just thought we would keep some of the best animals so we could sacrifice those to God." But Samuel is just not having it. He's like, "Just shut up and listen to what God has told me to tell you now." And Samuel goes on to tell Saul that because Saul has not listened to God and has rejected God's command, that God has now rejected Saul as king. And God has decided that Saul's lineage will be removed from the throne, and Saul will be replaced by someone that is not a part of his family. And I'll just tell you that, yes, that does eventually happen. Eventually, Saul is replaced by a man named David, you might have heard of, that killed the giant Goliath. But anyway, that's another story for another time. But now there's still this issue of King Agag, who was kept alive so that Saul could kind of parade him through the streets and show that he had conquered this other king and kind of get some glory out of the whole thing. Well, King Agag is just kind of like sitting there alive. And for Samuel, that is still a big problem. So after this little conversation between Saul and Samuel is over, here's what it says happens next. Then Samuel said, "Bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." And Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. And that was the end of King Agag. It's always been kind of a shocking story to me because when I read about the prophet Samuel, I'm thinking of like some like older, elderly kind of guy. I don't know exactly how old he was when this happened, but just thinking of some old man picking up a sword and hacking a guy to death is kind of crazy. In one more interesting twist of irony, there was an Amalekite man who would later claim to be the one who killed King Saul. He was involved in his death in some sort of way, it seems. So a little bit ironic, because maybe if Saul had done what he was supposed to do and killed all the Amalekites, that guy wouldn't have been around to kill him. Anyway, that's just a little bonus fact there. For the next item here, we're going to go back to the book of Judges, and I want to tell you about a man named Abimelech. Abimelech is the son of one of the most famous judges in the entire book of Judges. That was a man named Gideon. But the thing is, Gideon had over 70 sons. And Abimelech was one of the sons that Gideon had with a concubine, so it was a woman that wouldn't have been considered his legal wife. So in that way, he would have been seen more as like an illegitimate son, but he was the son of Gideon nonetheless. Well, after Gideon dies, there's no clear leader for the Israelites. And in this power vacuum, Abimelech decides that he wants to be the next leader of the Israelites. So he goes to Shechem. Shechem is kind of like his hometown where his mom and his mom's family lives. And he starts convincing his mom's family and the local people of this town, Shechem, that he should be the next leader of Israel. He convinces them to give him a lot of money. They go to their temple. They have this temple to Baal, who's like a false god. And they basically raid that temple and give him all the money from that temple so that he can raise an army. And he does. He goes out and hires a bunch of mercenaries, and he takes his gang of mercenaries to this other town called Ophrah. And once he gets to Ophrah, he rounds up all of his brothers, all 71 of them, and it says he puts 70 of them to death on the same stone. So he just systematically slaughters all of his brothers and half-brothers, except for one. There's one that gets away, and that one's name is Jotham. He hides while all this is going on, and he is able to escape death. But after this happens, the Shechemites, the people of Shechem, they make him king. And this is the first time in the Bible that we see someone take leadership of the nation of Israel by force and manipulation. Up until this point, it had been people that God was appointing, and God would raise them up, and then when they were done, he would raise up somebody else. And it wasn't people necessarily with this big power struggle, but this is the first time we see someone kind of appointing themselves to be the judge. And spoiler alert, that is not going to work out well for Abimelech. But he does end up ruling for 3 years. Now let's go back to this guy Jotham, the brother who escaped from the massacre. At some point, Jotham goes up this mountain, Mount Gerizim, and he kind of pronounces this curse over Abimelech and also the town of Shechem. But the way that he does it is interesting. He starts out by telling this parable, and I'll tell it to you and then I'll explain what it means. Jotham tells this parable about a bunch of trees who decide that they want to have a ruler. And so this group of trees goes out and talks to an olive tree. And they say, hey, olive tree, we want you to be our ruler. We want you to reign over us. But the olive tree is like, I don't know. I'm kind of, I'm doing a good job producing fruit and doing my own thing. I don't think it's a good idea for me to reign over you. And so the olive tree declines their offer. Well, they go next to a fig tree, and the same thing happens. The fig tree doesn't want to be their ruler. He just wants to be a fig tree. Then they go to a vine, and this is talking about like a grapevine. And they ask the vine to be their ruler, and the vine says the same thing. He says, I don't want to be your ruler. It's not right for me to rule over you. But these trees are so desperate for a ruler that eventually they go to a bramble. A bramble is just a little thorny, worthless bush. It's nothing. It's just something you would pull out of the ground. But they ask the bramble to be their leader. They ask the bramble to reign over them. And the bramble agrees to do that. The bramble even says, yeah, get under my shade and I'll take care of you. Now that's kind of a funny line because a bramble is just a little bush that's low to the ground. It doesn't have any shade to get under. But this is the point that Jotham is making with this little parable. He's saying, we've had all these worthy judges that have come before, like Gideon and Deborah and all these other judges that have come up before. People have tried to make them king, and they were always wise enough to say, no, it's not right for me to be the king, even though they were worthy of that. But now these people have become so desperate to have a king that they've sought out this little bramble, Abimelech, this guy who's not worthy at all to be king, and they've decided to make him king over them. And then he announces sort of like a curse, or maybe it's a prediction, whatever you want to call it. But he basically says that there's going to be mutual destruction between Abimelech and the people of Shechem. In other words, they're going to destroy each other. And this kind of sets the stage for exactly what does happen. So after 3 years of rule, Shechem turns on Abimelech. They actually revolt. They have this uprising against Abimelech. Well, Abimelech doesn't like that, so of course he fights back and he actually crushes this rebellion. Just completely destroys this rebellion. But he goes a step further and he destroys the entire city. He even goes so far as to sow salt into the ground so that they can never use that ground again. And then as all this is happening, the people of the city have fled into this like big tower in the center of the city, which I guess they thought would protect them. They could be fortified in there and maybe have a fighting chance to live. Well, there were like 1,000 people in there, and Abimelech just says, let's just set it on fire. And so he sets this tower on fire and just burns up everybody inside. So when all is said and done, Abimelech completely demolishes Shechem and just kills everybody. But Abimelech doesn't stop there. There's another town up the road called Thebez. It's just about 10 miles away. And we don't know exactly why he's mad at Thebez. Maybe they had something to do with the rebellion, or they just wouldn't submit the way he wanted them to. We don't know. But he takes his army and then he attacks the town of Thebez. It starts out being a very similar situation to where he's just destroying things and burning things and killing everybody. And it's even similar in that a lot of the people flee inside of this tower. And Abimelech, he's just going to do what he did last time. He's just going to go set the tower on fire and kill everybody inside. But you see, there's a woman way up high in this tower and she has an upper millstone. If you're not familiar with what a millstone is, let me explain real quickly. A millstone really had two parts. The lower part of the millstone was this really huge stone. Nobody's going to pick that up by themselves. But everybody had their own upper millstone. You would bring your own upper millstone and you'd put it on top of the big one, and then you'd put grain or something under it, and you'd turn that top part of the millstone around so that it grinds the grain under it. Probably the worst explanation of a millstone ever, but there you go. But just know that the upper millstone was a very heavy rock. It would have been a round stone, 12 to 18 inches in diameter and about 2 to 4 inches thick. So anywhere from 30 to 60 pounds is how much this stone would have weighed. But as he approaches the door of the tower to start the fire so that he can kill everybody inside, well, let me just read to you what happens next. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed me. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham the son of Gideon. So yeah, you can imagine that falling on your head from from any height is going to do quite a bit of damage. Apparently it didn't kill Abimelech right away. He had to have his armor bearer finish him off. But yeah, that would be a pretty horrendous way to die. All right, that's all I got for you today, but I really, really, really appreciate you if you listen this far. There's a lot of really interesting deaths mentioned in the Old Testament. It was kind of hard to narrow it down to just 5, so maybe one day I'll have to do a part 2 to this video and tell you about some more. But anyway, I enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. Take care.